acknowledge the Wurundjeri people who are the traditional custodians of this land. I would also like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, of the Kulin Nation, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians present today. So, Peter Singer, I'm sure many of you know who he is. He probably doesn't need an introduction, but let me tell you more about him. So, he is a professor of bioethics at Princeton University and a laureate professor at the University of Melbourne. He is also the author of the books Animal Liberation and The Ethics of What We Eat. We are so lucky to have him here today to share his knowledge with us. So please join me in welcoming Peter Singer.
I'm not really sure that I need the microphone, so I'll make sure that you can hear me at the back now. And can you still hear me at the back now? Good, okay. Of what we eat, but I'm particularly focusing on questions about the use of animal foods, because that seems to me to be, in a way, the major ethical question. It's not the only one. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, so if there are other ethical issues you want to raise that I haven't covered, by all means, feel free to raise them. And in terms of talking about the ethical questions raised by the use of animal foods, I'm going to be talking about impact on animals, impact on the environment, and just briefly towards the end about what this means in terms of availability of food for a growing world population. So that's a rough outline of what I'm talking about. So, if we're talking about animals, and if you're interested in reducing animal suffering in general, then food is really the biggest issue that you can focus on. It really dwarfs the other issues that where we inflict suffering on animals. People, for example, often, when I got into the animal movement, perhaps the most prominent issue that people were talking about was the use of animals in research and experimentation. And that's certainly a significant issue. 100 million animals a year being used in research, which is a pretty approximate figure because we don't have good data, is a lot of animals, certainly. But you compare it to the number of animals used in food production, and in fact, probably it's over 60 billion now, because that's figure's a few years old and it's been rising. So 60 billion as compared to 100 million, you're talking about something like 600 times more animals, and that's just vertebrate animals, and it's just land animals. Most particularly, it doesn't include fish. So you're talking about a really huge number of animals here that are being raised for food. And the majority of them, as I'll show you in a moment, are not having good lives. But let's not forget fish. The numbers with fish are even harder to estimate, because although you can get numbers from governments about the numbers of cows or pigs or chickens that are slaughtered each year in various countries, when you're talking about fish, the numbers available actually talk about tons. They don't even think of fish as individuals. And then you have to think, well, what species is this? What's the average weight of a fish? And so on. But according to fishcount.org.uk, they suggest it's at least 1 trillion, maybe more than that. And although many of them are not interfered with during their lives, I'll come to this towards the end, there is basically no humane slaughter for fish. So there's a lot of suffering there. But let's look particularly, let's go back for the moment to the land animals that who we're eating. And the question I want to ask is, in this talk, because I'm trying to deal with a fairly wide area, I'm not going to go into a lot of arguments about exactly what the moral status of animals should be. I've argued elsewhere in Animal Liberation that we should give equal consideration to similar interests. So an interest in not feeling pain should count as much, whether it's a human or a non-human animal. But rather than develop that argument, I really want to ask this question. If animals count at all, if animal suffering matters, and I think today I can take it for granted that you will think that animal suffering matters. Just look at the reaction of the Australian public and even of the Minister for Agriculture, to the live sheep export footage that was shown a month or two ago. Nobody was saying, oh, well, that's fine because animal suffering doesn't matter. The whole discussion was about, do we have to ban the trade to stop it, or can we regulate the trade to stop it? So, assume that animal suffering matters, then the question is there any defensible view of animals so that's compatible with the facts about factory farming? So let's look at some of those facts, and although many of you may have actually taken the trouble to go online and look at what factory farming is like or read accounts, most people really don't know very much about it still, despite the efforts of all the animal organisations. This is a quote not from an animal rights activist or anyone like that, but from a professor of animal science at Oregon State University. So essentially a professor who is teaching future animal producers in the United States. But he himself acknowledges that there isn't much transparency, that most members of the public don't really know how their, particularly he's talking about chicken here, how their chicken is produced, and that if they could see them being raised, harvested and processed, i.e. killed, then many of them would swear off eating chicken and perhaps all meat. So there's at least an ethical doubt, an ethical shadow about the idea that people are not really aware of how their food is produced, and if they were aware of it, they would be more disturbed about it than they are. So let's try to make sure that we do understand a little bit more about how it's produced. So let's take the example that was talked about, Professor Cheek talked about in that example. This is what's known as a broiler house, essentially chickens being raised for meat. As you can see, it's a vast shed, recedes into the distance, and it's full of birds pretty much covering the entire floor space. That's the way they're raised. Of course, when they're introduced, they're smaller and there's a bit more space around, but as they get closer to being ready for market, that's about how crowded it gets. These lines that you see are bringing food and water into the shed. So it's completely automated. There's no need for any real human intervention. Somebody will walk through the shed maybe towards the end of the day and pick up the corpses, and I'll explain to you why there's going to be corpses in a moment. But that's about all the actual human attention that they get. Now there is a whole number of problems in terms of welfare of these birds. One is, as you can see, that they're obviously crowded. They can't really get to know other individuals. The normal sort of social group for hens and the jungle fowl from which they developed might be a group of 20 or 30 hens, and it's been shown that up to about 90 hens recognise each other as individuals, so they know the other hens. Hens have a pecking order, that's where the expression comes from, a hierarchy, so you know which birds you're dominant over, and you can sort of peck at them or threaten them and they'll get out of your way, and you know which birds you have to get out of their way or they'll peck at you. But once you get to 20,000 birds, as you might have in this shed, obviously you can't recognise them as individuals, so there's stress in terms of constantly encountering strangers and you don't know how to relate to them. So that's one problem. Another problem that you can sense if you ever walk into these sheds is that the droppings are simply allowed to lie on the floor for the entire time that they're being raised, which is not very long per group of hens, per group of chickens. They're bred to grow very quickly. About 7 weeks is all it takes to get them to market weight. But it's not likely to be cleaned out between groups either. It might be cleaned out every year perhaps. So the air just reeks of ammonia. It really gets in your eyes as soon as you go in there, and you know, you don't want to spend very long in there, but of course the chickens are there the whole time. But the worst problem, I think, is a problem related to the fact that they are bred to grow and put on weight very, very fast. So, as I said, these are young birds when they're at market weight, about 7 weeks, which about is half the age that chickens used to be brought to market, or even less than half. But they're the same weight. So you've got birds that are bred to eat a great deal, put on weight very fast, but their bones are not really mature. Their legs have not actually matured enough to cope with the weight that they put on. So what quite often happens, and what's happened to this bird, is that the bird's legs have collapsed under her or under him. And if you know chickens, if you've known them chickens, they don't sit down in that position normally. Something's gone wrong. So this bird's legs have collapsed. Essentially, it's got broken legs and is not going to be able to move. Now, if you remember the picture of the shed, if she's not close enough to those pipes that bring food and water, she's going to die, she's going to dehydrate and die of thirst. Or she would starve, but probably she'll die of thirst first. And as I said, she'll get no individual attention. Somebody will come and maybe pick up the corpse when she's dead, but that's the most. And even that doesn't necessarily happen very frequently. So it's for this reason that Professor John Webster, who's a professor of veterinary medicine and the founder of a big centre for research into animal welfare in the UK at Bristol, said that he regards this form of farming as the greatest cruelty perpetrated on animals by humans. Because obviously, firstly, it's on a vast scale. I don't actually know the Australian figures, but in the United States it's about 9 billion chickens produced every year. And secondly, even if the bird's legs don't collapse to that point, even if they're not actually slowly dying like that one is, they are in pain because of their legs not bearing their weight for at least the last couple of weeks of their life. So for roughly about a third of their lives, they're in the kind of pain Professor Webster says it would be similar to somebody with arthritis. You know, somebody who's got arthritis and has pain standing, uncomfortable standing without pain relief anyway, then Professor Webster says that's what these birds are experiencing. And they can't really sit down on this litter either, and this bird, as I said, has collapsed, but because the droppings are part of this so-called litter, the straw stuff, it actually gets quite alkaline from that, and if they sit down on it, it produces skin burns on their skin. So they're not comfortable sitting on it for prolonged periods either. So that's probably, I think, the greatest form of suffering, but egg production, standard factory farm egg production, is also pretty awful. You see here how crowded the hens are. They're crammed into these cages. The eggs sort of roll down the floor and come out the front, so it's also a highly automated sort of system. And as a result of the crowding, you find that the feathers get rubbed off because they're rubbing against the wire. They can't really move away. They're also stressed because of not being able to get away from dominant birds. As I mentioned, that pecking order. Well, you can't actually get away from a dominant bird in your cage, so you're likely to be pecked. To prevent the birds actually pecking each other to death, I think you can see it better on this previous slide, every chick gets her beak clipped off before she goes when she's young. So you see the blunted sort of top beak, although the lower beak here seems to have grown out. Seems to be not a very carefully done debeaking, but that doesn't relieve the stress, obviously, of the crowding. It just means that the birds don't actually peck each other to death. And people sometimes say, well, you know, these birds, they've been indoors all their life. They get used to it. They don't have instincts to do anything different. But that's not true. Here's a very lucky ex-factory farm hen, because rather than just being chucked out to slaughter after about a year or so of laying, because at that point the rate of lay drops off, this one got rescued, and she's been put out on grass. One thing you see from the photo is again how bad condition of her feathers around her neck, around her tail, and even the wings are pretty much missing there. But the other thing is, when people do this, and some people do manage to adopt ex-factory hens because they'll still live and lay eggs for another couple of years, just not at the same high rate that the commercial producers require, you'll find that she's pretty soon doing things that she could never do before. So she's off chasing butterflies or insects, she's pecking for worms, she might find a bit of dusty ground and she'll dust bathe, she fluffs up, hens like to fluff up dust under their feathers, and when she's ready to lay an egg, she'll look around for some nesting material to build up and sit comfortably on. None of which she could do in the cage, but she apparently has these instincts which are being thwarted while she's in that cage. Okay, let's just move briefly through pigs. Pigs are, these are the pigs who are being reared and sold for pork, ham or bacon. You can see they're also very crowded. They're in, they can move around, not quite as crowded as the hens' cages perhaps, but very crowded conditions, and perhaps worse for the pigs, basically nothing really to do all day, except, you know, once, twice a day they'll get a bit of food put in front of them and they'll eat that. They'll do that in, I don't know, 10, 20 minutes, and then there's nothing much else to do again all day. And pigs are very intelligent, playful animals. If you read George Orwell's Animal Farm, you know he made them the bosses of the farm, and that's, you know, they are quite possibly the most intelligent of the farm animals. And if they were out in a varied environment, they would be spending their day rooting around for food, and they would be doing a whole variety of different activities. If they have things to play with, they'll play with them as well. But in a typical factory farm, they don't have many options, so they're probably just bored all day. And even worse are the conditions for their mothers. These are the breeding sows. These are the sows whose role is just to produce the piglets, and they'll be kept for a few litters, and then again when their rate of fertility drops off, they'll also be thrown out. But they are still standardly being kept in these individual stalls. I think I've got another shot of them as well. Gives you a better sense. Oh no, that's a different one. That's the when they have the piglets. Okay, so while they're pregnant, you can see how narrow this stall is. Basically just as wide as the sow is. And again, she's on bare concrete, sometimes they're on metal slats. She can't turn around in that space. She can take half a step forwards or backwards, that's about all the movement she can do. And since she's pregnant for most of her life, that's where she is for most of her life. She also has nothing to do all day. She might start gnawing on the bars just to relieve the stress, but there's nothing else that occupies her. This is what happens when she actually delivers her piglets. She's moved to what's called a farrowing crate, where she gives birth, and then the piglets can suckle on her. So now she basically becomes a milking machine for the piglets. If she were given space and the materials to do it, for example in a forest, pigs are originally forest animals, she would have gathered leaves and grass and stuff like that. She would have built a kind of big nest that she could bed in, and she would look after the pigs that way. She would be able to move around. She's not given that because that's, you know, basically costly to provide her with space and straw. It's cheaper this way. The way she's held in this crate is supposed to prevent her actually rolling on top of and crushing any of the piglets, which again, if she was given enough space, she probably wouldn't do, but this is a cheaper solution to that problem. Okay, so that's the sort of animal welfare focus of factory farming, and as I said, I don't think there's any way of thinking about the ethics of how we treat animals that can defend that, because it's not that it's something that we are doing that's essential for our survival. And again, I'll go into more details about that when I talk about the impact of animal farming on global food production. But it's actually not producing more food for humans. So the only reason really you can defend it is in terms of people like the taste of those products, and this is the cheapest way to meet that market demand that comes because people like the taste of these products. But if you think about, you compare that with other things which are basically forms of enjoyment where animals are suffering, we aren't really prepared to accept the idea that it's okay to make animals suffer just because we enjoy it in some way. So a classic example would be getting animals to fight each other, cockfighting or dog fighting, because people enjoy that as a spectacle. We think that that's wrong. We don't accept that. We don't accept bullfighting either. We don't accept humans fighting animals for enjoyment. There are some cultures that do, but if you actually compare, let's say you take bullfighting, you compare the amount of suffering that goes on, I think it's much worse in factory farming than it is in bullfighting. Because the bulls in bullfights in Spain, say, actually have pretty good lives until the last 2 hours, let's say, in the bull ring, which is certainly horrible. But that mightn't be a bad trade-off if you had to choose between that and an entire lifetime confined and bored and perhaps suffering in the case of the chickens. So I wouldn't say that it's worse for the bull than it is for the chickens. If anything, I'd say the other way around. And perhaps the number of people getting enjoyment from the bullfight is obviously greater than, from watching a small number of bulls being killed, is greater than the number of people who get enjoyment from the suffering of the chickens. So I think if you're just balancing animal suffering against human enjoyment, eating meat from factory farms comes out worse than a lot of the things that we would not accept. Okay, let's move on to environmental impact. Now, I hadn't been talking about factory farming. I hadn't shown you beef production, cattle, but you can see it here. There's a lot more space per animal than there was for either the pigs or the chickens. No doubt about that. But this is a feedlot. These animals are clearly not on grass. They would have been on grass for the first part of their lives, and then at some stage, it varies a bit, they're brought to a feedlot to be fed grain, because feeding them on grain fattens them up faster and produces a quality of meat that certainly Americans, this is in Colorado, that Americans prefer, and Australians increasingly are coming around to that sort of taste, as well as some of our export markets that we're producing beef for. So we do have this system in Australia, but the reason I'm producing it now is that not only is this, again, a pretty boring life for the cows, even if they have room to move around, but it's also a huge source of methane, because cows, all ruminants in fact, cows and sheep and camels and so on, but we don't eat a lot of camel here, produce methane as part of their digestive process. And methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. Per unit, per tonne, let's say, methane is at least 27 times as powerful a contributor to global warming as carbon dioxide is. Now, one difference is that the methane breaks down faster. It stays in the atmosphere only about 20 to 30 years, whereas carbon dioxide is up there for centuries. So people argue that it's not that bad, but if we continue to have very large numbers of cattle, then we're putting more methane up all the time. And if you looked at what needs to be done in relation to global warming, we don't really have all that much time to make a dramatic reduction in the greenhouse gases we're putting up in the atmosphere. If we leave it too late, then we get feedback loops cutting in, and we're not really going to be able to control how far it goes. So I think that given that time pressure, the amount of methane going into the atmosphere from cattle is something that's very significant, and it is also obviously something that we could change very rapidly. In some ways it's easier to switch our diet than it is to switch our consumption of electricity, let's say, because that's a certain time lag to getting out of coal and fossil fuels and getting into solar or wind, building enough production to get that, building storage facilities needed for that. It can be done, I think it should be done, but the quickest way to make a dramatic reduction in climate change would be to cut meat out of our diet. So how much does that do? Well, here's one way of looking at it. Compare it with switching from your typical, this was done for the US, but it's not that different here, your typical American car, and this is not even a big four-wheel drive, just a standard sedan, Toyota Camry. Compare that to switching to a Prius, fuel-efficient hybrid. You will save about 1 tonne of carbon emissions per year. On the other hand, if you switch, again, this is for Americans who may be have a somewhat more beef-heavy diet than we do, but we certainly eat plenty of it. But if you switch from that diet to a vegan diet with the same number of calories, you save 1.5 tonnes per year. So this is a good way of making a pretty significant reduction in your carbon footprint. It's certainly not the only thing you can do. I think there are other things we should be doing, but it's one thing that we can do that does clearly make that sort of difference. Here's a few statements to back that up. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, in a report more than 10 years old now, but I think it's stood up pretty well, says the livestock sector generates more greenhouse gas emissions than the whole transport sector. So all cars, trucks, planes, trains, ships, everything produces a smaller contribution to greenhouse gases to global warming than the livestock sector. And what all that means is that if we are going to try to meet the climate accord, the Paris Accord, and those goals of staying below 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures, we really do need to reduce our meat consumption. And particularly, part of the problem is that meat consumption is growing in parts of the world that are becoming more prosperous. China, East Asia generally have increasing meat consumption. And we can't really tell them to stop that because they're actually at a per capita level, they're below our meat consumption. So we can hardly say, hey, you shouldn't be increasing your meat consumption when we're maintaining a level that is higher than theirs. So we certainly need to reduce. Of course, we do need to hope that they won't continue too far, but I think it is required that we reduce if we're going to avoid catastrophic climate change. And here's one myth that I want to dispel. You sometimes see people advertising, restaurants, organic, advertising, our beef is all grass-fed, 100% grass-fed, meaning that the animals don't go to the feedlots like I showed you, which is significant in some ways, significant in terms of the impact on global food production, as I'll be talking about, and definitely a better life for the animals, no question about that. But it's actually worse for climate change, paradoxically. This is one of these situations where you just don't have an ideal solution. Why is it worse? Well, it's worse in a way. It relates to the reason why the producers put their cattle in feedlots. They put them in feedlots because they put on weight more quickly than if they're on grass. It's a more concentrated food that they're feeding them. So think of it then conversely, to put on a kilo of beef on grass, the cow has to be on the grass longer. It has to be digesting longer, eating and digesting longer per kilo of beef. And since that's what's producing the methane, the digestive process of the animal, the more digestion that goes on per kilo of beef, the more greenhouse gas emissions there are per kilo of beef. So it makes sense when you think about it, but that is certainly a problem for saying, oh, well, I'll switch to grass-fed beef. Yeah, good in some ways, but not good for the climate. Okay, another way of comparing the significance of going vegetarian or vegan for as compared to other things that you might do. There's a lot of talk about eating locally. that we should buy food locally, shop at local farmers markets, and clearly that again is a good thing in some ways. You're supporting your local farming community, that's nice. You get to know more about how the food is produced if you talk to them, that's nice. They're probably not big factory farmers, that's clearly a good thing as well. So yeah, fine, do that. But you probably also think, oh, and I'm reducing my greenhouse gas footprint because the food is not travelling so far. Well, yes, that's true, but it's actually a fairly minor contribution. And as this study suggests, the difference between eating a standard American meat-based diet and going vegetarian is much greater than the difference between buying locally and not worrying about that, just buying from wherever your supermarket gets it. In fact, it's at least 7 times greater, because as this thing says, you could do less for the planet by being totally local than by being vegetarian 1 day per week. So that's indication that the food miles metric that a lot of people talk about is less important than the content of what you're eating. Okay, so here's another statement about, I mentioned the Paris Accord, the goal of trying to reduce, keep global temperature rise to not more than 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. As this study from the Royal Institute of International Affairs suggests, that's going to be very difficult to do if we don't reduce the emissions footprint of the livestock sector. Because that's going to, as fossil fuels come down, as we do succeed in replacing fossil fuel with solar and wind in particular, then the meat contribution is going to become a bigger share of what we're actually doing. So we're going to have to bring that down to reach those levels. Then there's also local pollution from factory farming. Some, depending where you live, you may be more or less aware of that, but it's certainly a problem when factory farms open in rural areas, if they have neighbours close by. Significant water pollution, significant air pollution if you're close to them as well. So that's a further issue. So the last of the 3 things I want to talk about before we go to Q&A is this question about feeding the world. And as I said, factory farming is not an effective way of producing food, because when you take the animals away from the foods that they would otherwise eat, like the grass, you have to feed them on grain or on soybeans, sometimes on fish meal. So more than 1/3 of all the grain produced in the world is fed to animals, including, say, 70% of the US grain crop. In addition, there's soybeans and fish meal fed to animals. And all of this is really wasteful, because the animal has to use most of that food value just to go on living. And in the case of birds and mammals, obviously to keep their bodies warm. That burns food to do that, and then to produce things that we don't eat, like bones and other parts of the body. So we're wasting 5 kilos of protein to produce for every kilo of meat that we produce. So when people say, well, we have to do this intensive farming to feed the growing population, it's actually the reverse of the truth. We could feed them much better otherwise. This is another chart from the United States Department of Agriculture and the Food and Agriculture Organization and various other bodies that set up a group on producing protein. So here you see in graph form how many pounds of usable protein you get per acre or hectare. I guess this is probably in acres. And you see that soybeans come out on top. And interestingly, even other grain crops that you don't think of as being particularly high in protein, but because they do have some protein, you actually produce more protein from rice and corn, other legumes and wheat, than you do from the animal products. So all of the animal products are down the bottom of this line, with milk being the best of the animal products and protein per acre, but still way down as compared to what's that, a quarter about as compared to what it is with soybeans. Eggs is close. Meat in general is another drop down, and beef is really the worst of them, because beef cattle stomachs are not well adapted to converting grain into meat, so you lose more there. So it's not an effective way of doing it, and that's another reason why if we do want to feed the world, we ought to be avoiding it. Now let me say quick thing about fish, and then one more thing I'll say, and then we'll finish off. So what about fish? Well, one thing you could say about fish is that the wild-caught fish, if we're talking about them, at least we don't interfere with their lives. So a little bit like the bulls in the bull ring, perhaps, they have a normal life, and then they have a couple of bad hours, or maybe more, because it depends on how they're being caught. So this is a huge long line net that is being pulled in by a trawler. You can see it's full of fish. Some of them are being forced out through the net, through the holes in the net, by the pressure of all of the other fish in it. So it's a vast number of fish. Some of the nets actually are drift nets. I don't think this is, but some are drift nets which are just left to drift in the sea for quite a long time before being hauled in. Fish get stuck in them. They don't see them. They try and swim through them. Then they get stuck. So they're actually trapped underwater, and it'll be they could be there dying for days, quite a long time before the net is hauled in. Other fish will be hauled up on the deck and essentially will suffocate on the deck of the ship. Some of them, deep sea fish, get hauled up from the deep and suffer decompression. What happens to divers if they come up too quickly? They get the bends, which is very painful. But this is to the point of killing the fish, which basically they're being killed because their organs are expanding inside them and exploding inside them. So pretty horrible death, even if their lives have not been affected directly by humans. Also, there's questions of sustainability, so just sticking with the wild-caught fish, as I say, there's no humane killing. And gradually we are fishing out, despite the efforts to try to stop it, we have destroyed many of the great fish stocks of the oceans over the decades, and we are still doing that. We're getting rid of a lot of fish of the oceans and damaging ocean ecology. And then we have, we're now increasingly going into aquaculture, where we do confine the fish, and it seems pretty clear that they are stressed by the confinement, though we don't know a lot about fish psychology. It's not as well studied as with the land animals, obviously harder to study. But I do think they're suffering from confinement. Again, there's really no humane killing. And we're still depleting the oceans, at least with carnivorous fish like salmon, which is we produce with aquaculture, because we have to catch fish to feed the fish. It's the same story as with growing the grain. We catch low-value fish, we grind it up into fish pellets, and we feed it to the salmon. But we need to catch 2 kilos of fish for every kilo of salmon we produce. So it's still wasteful, it's still depleting the ocean and damaging ocean ecology. Okay, one final slide. The future, is there going to be ethical meat? What you see here is a meat cabinet which has in it the Beyond Burger, which is now on sale in Australia. The Beyond Burger is actually a plant-based burger patty, which is intended to mimic the taste and feel of meat more closely than previous burgers, and there's a fair bit of work going on to do that with plant-based foods. So that's not ethical meat, because that's not really meat, it's just there's something that's produced that looks like meat, but is a form of plant protein that's better on the environment and obviously doesn't cause animal suffering. But what other people are working on is what some of us call in vitro meat, better perhaps cultured meat, and some people are trying to get it to be called clean meat, because it's free of animal, of coming from any animal. It's produced in a factory, but it is actually meat grown at the cellular level. So you start with a cell from an animal cell of meat, and then you put it in a liquid where it can grow, and eventually then you harvest off the cells. And we're told that at least the production of cultured meat burgers may be only a year or two away. That could be quite close. I think it's going to be a lot longer before we get to cultured meat steaks to produce that kind of texture. But that again would be environmentally friendly, would not involve any animal suffering, and I think would be an ethical kind of meat that you could consume if you wanted to consume it for those reasons. Okay, so I've gone fairly fast so that we still have some time for questions. I think we're aiming to finish at about 5 past, and that clock is about 5 minutes fast as well. So we have something like a quarter of an hour anyway for questions if you have some. Okay, we'll start with you.
What can you tell us about kangaroo meat production and the efforts of that?
Okay, so kangaroos are not farmed. Nobody has successfully developed farming of kangaroos. So if you buy kangaroo, it's from kangaroos who are being wild kangaroos who are being shot by roo shooters. In that sense, again, we don't interfere much with their lives. So what are the problems? Well, ideally, the code of practice says that the shooters are supposed to shoot kangaroos in the head, and if they do shoot a kangaroo in the head, it will be a pretty much instant kill. But they don't all do that because it's harder to hit the kangaroo in the head, obviously. They have relatively small heads, they have big chests. You might miss. So certainly a number of them are not killed, are not shot in the head and don't die instantly. The other thing that's been happening is that kangaroos are marsupials, so they have young who are in the pouch, the joeys, and who rely on the mother to get milk. Sometimes they're out of the pouch for a while, but then they hop back in. The shooting takes place at night because that's when kangaroos are more stationary and you can find them more easily. They're standing around at night. So the joeys, so if you shoot a female kangaroo, then there's a question of what happens to the joey. The joey may be out of the pouch, in which case he'll hop off into the dark and no kangaroo shooter is going to try and find that joey. It's just not worth the time and bother. So that joey will probably just starve to death without the mother. The joey may be in the pouch, in which case the shooter should pull the joey out and humanely kill it. I've seen video of them sort of bashing them by the head against the bull bar of their vehicle or something like that. It looks pretty brutal. Arguably, if that's done properly, it does produce a pretty instant death. So I would say actually, from the animal suffering point of view, if you are going to eat meat at all, which I don't think you need to, kangaroo meat is more humane than factory farm meat. But there is a question about what's it doing to the kangaroo population, and there's conflicting argument about that, about whether it's actually causing kangaroos to become endangered, at least in certain ranges, not across the entire country, but in certain areas which are easy of access to the shooters, their numbers are shrinking. So that's one argument. That's one argument against it. And the other thing is, there's no sense in which it's possibly a replacement for the amount of other animal food that we're producing. Because kangaroos don't have very much meat on them, basically. So you could kill the entire Australian population of kangaroos 3 times over, and it wouldn't replace the amount of beef that Australians eat. So it's always going to be a niche rather than a replacement. Yes?
What do you think is the best method for helping the general population, I guess, transition towards more of a plant-based diet and kind of look more favourably on eating less meat or cutting out meat? Do you think it will be more of like an overpopulation and economic factors as to like the price of meat increasing than actually moral or ethical reasons?
Look, it's hard to say. I think it's a combination, but I think the production of plant-based foods that taste and feel like meat and that are economically competitive with meat, and also that don't have the risk of salmonella, for example, could well be an important factor. Clearly, there has been a great rise in vegan eating. You can see that around Melbourne. You can see it in pretty much every city in developed countries anyway, that they have greater availability of vegan food. So it's not clear to me what's actually achieving that. It might be concern about animals, it might be concern about the environment, it might be concern about health. I didn't go into health because I wanted to talk about the ethics of what we eat, but there is certainly evidence, particularly about red and processed meat being associated with cancers of the digestive system. So all of those factors could come together, but I'm hopeful that it'll be making it easier by giving people products that they're more used to, more like the food they're used to, is also going to be a factor. And the more you get, then you get this kind of spiral where there'll be more products produced because there'll be more market for them, and it'll get easier and easier. That's what I'm hoping will happen.
Do you ever imagine a time when we look back and think eating animals was barbaric and wonder why?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I said that in Animal Liberation, which first appeared in 1975. I think I compared it with the way we look on the Roman games in the Colosseum when they got, lions and prisoners to fight or something like that. I think we will, yeah. There was a hand up the back, the white shirt there, yeah.
Sort of more a question about practical ethics rather than ethics, but in terms of actually getting the transition to veganism, like I think for a lot of people, myself included, it's a hard, it seems like a huge change to begin with. Do you think in arguing for animal rights or vegan activists or whatever, that they would have more success in arguing for a more radial sort of approach, like maybe avoiding animals that they know are factory farmed, or suggest that maybe they should eat more offal, it's going to go to waste anyway? Do you think that would have more success than this binary sort of animal or plant-based diet?
Yeah, there's some reason for thinking that. In fact, there's a person in the psychology department here, or a couple of people, I think, here at Melbourne, a guy called Brock Bastian, who's been doing research on psychology of why people continue to eat meat when, because a lot of people say, oh yeah, I don't feel good about meat, I know it causes a lot of suffering, I know it's bad for the environment. So he's been doing research into why people continue to eat meat under those circumstances, and his view is that making it a binary thing, that's suggesting to people, well, really you need to go vegan, that's the only ethical diet, can be, at least with some people, counterproductive. And that it's better to do it gradually. There's various ways of doing that. One would be, as you suggested, to say, well, just avoid factory farming. Another one would be to say, well, cut out meat on Mondays, and there's a Meatless Monday movement in the United States. I don't know if it's had any impact here. But some schools, for example, make a point of serving vegetarian food on Mondays. So do it that way, get people used to it. Maybe they'll then start having meatless Thursdays as well or something, and gradually move on. So I think those sorts of things are worth trying. We don't really know for sure, but it's definitely worth trying. Yes, in the middle there.
What would you say to people who would make the argument that as humans at the top of the food chain, and I guess sort of accompanying that argument is often our historical practices of gathering, sort of killing animals in that way, and then also the fact that we're top of the food chain, so it's natural for us to eat meat. What do you say to that sort of argument?
I don't think it's a good ethical argument at all. It's a little bit like having white people saying, well, we're the dominant race in this planet because we have the best weapons and the best military. Let's go back to colonialism. So I don't think you can draw any ethical conclusions from that. It's just that's the way things evolve, and we shouldn't regard evolution as having a kind of moral flavour to it. It's if you understand the process, it doesn't have any particular moral direction. Up the back there.
Do you think the vegan movement or vegans should consider animal products that have a lesser environmental impact than their non-animal alternatives? And the examples I'm thinking here are how you can be found locally a lot more commonly than you can find corn syrup or agave syrup, wool versus synthetic clothing, collected down versus synthetic clothing, and mussels and oysters.
Okay, so let me take the mussels and oysters first, because I think that's a separate category. Because the arguments that I gave you about animal suffering clearly apply to animals who can suffer. I think it's probable that mussels and oysters can't suffer, because they have very rudimentary nervous systems, and after all, they can't really run away from danger anyway. So it makes sense that in evolutionary terms they would not have evolved the kind of nervous system that other more mobile animals have to move away from sources of danger. So, and in environmental terms, mussel and oysters, when we farm them, when we grow them, they actually clean up water supplies. So yes, in that sense, they're good. So, you know, I don't really have an objection to people who want to eat mussels and oysters. I think that's okay. With the other things, the others that you mentioned, though, it's not only the environmental effects that I'm concerned about. I am concerned about the suffering. Now, with some of those things, you could produce them in ways that give animals good lives. Certainly, say, wool production could be produced in ways that are compatible with sheep having good lives. Unfortunately, that's not the way we're doing it here in Australia for a variety of reasons. But again, the most dramatic is that the older sheep get sent to the Middle East on these horrible live transports. But if you did that, I guess you would have a better sort of case for saying that. And certainly, I do think you ought to take the environmental impact of non-animal products into account as well.
I've got a follow-up question. So, like, I've been sort of involved in the vegan movement sort of over the past 2 years, and one thing I find really interesting is a lot of people really care about honey and care about insects, and that's okay. But there seems to be no consideration for the fact that like millions of insects die in the production of like any grain, and also like you have like there are also like bees specifically are used, like honeybees specifically, and their off-season crop producing honey are used to pollinate plants such as almonds, and they're not considered at all except when they're producing honey. So
yeah, I mean, I think whether you need to avoid honey is again a debatable question, because it depends. Again, even from an animal suffering point of view, it depends on whether you think bees are capable of suffering, which I would be agnostic about that. As I said, I don't think oysters and mussels are. Bees, in terms of insects, are more sophisticated than most. They have more neurons than most, than many other insects, and they do have quite complex lives in terms of communicating to each other the source of nectar and so on. But I don't know, so I leave that one open. I don't have any firm views. Yes?
What's the ethics of drinking milk?
Oh, so the problem with milk, you're right, I didn't really go into that very much. Obviously, dairy cows are ruminants and emit greenhouse gases. But the other real problem with milk production is that standard milk production relies on making the cow pregnant. Cows, like humans, don't produce milk unless they've just given birth. And then after a while, it drops off. So cows are regularly, roughly yearly, made pregnant, and their calves are taken away from them. And again, like humans, cows are mammals. They have a very close bond, instinctive bond between the mother and the child. And it clearly causes suffering for the cow to have her calf removed. And then you have to ask what's happening to the calf. Well, the calf might get killed for veal at an early age. If she's a female, she might be reared for milk production herself. If she's a male, she might be kept a bit for hamburger. But I think the suffering, the separation is the worst thing. I did just hear, actually, earlier this year, somebody drew my attention to the fact that there is somewhere up near Shepparton a very small dairy farm that leaves the calves with the mothers. I've never heard of this in all the years I've been talking about this before. They have about 20 cows or something only, I think, so it's quite small. But they are selling milk. I can't remember the name of the product. Somebody know it? What is it?
It's called How Now.
That's right. How Now milk, yeah. And it's available in some, you can Google it, in some health stores, or stores, organic sort of food stores around Melbourne. So, that I think maybe eliminates a part of the problem anyway, that part of the problem, but still environmental issues. Was someone along there? Yeah.
A lot of people say that there's no such thing as ethical consumption under capitalism, or it's not possible. How do you respond to arguments like that and maintain motivation for individual choices when perhaps industrial and government level policies are more important?
Well, firstly, my ethic does depend on the consequences. So if you're going to say there's no ethical consumption under capitalism, then either we're all going to stop consuming, in which case we'll all die pretty soon, or you have to say, which is what I would say, is you go for the lesser evil, right? And that is, so you still consume the things that are less bad than the other things that you might say are bad. I do think that it would be good if we could have, you know, better systems of distribution and fairer systems of looking after people. If you have strategies whereby we're going to head towards those changes, good. But, you know, I can't actually personally see a strategy towards getting rid of capitalism. It's proved very resilient. You have all sorts of crises where people think this is going to be the end, but it comes back again. So again, it's a bit like the point about incrementally changing your diet. I think we need to try to reform capitalism and get rid of the worst elements of it, rather than really aim at getting rid of it altogether. I'll go to you. Yeah.
What's your opinion on sort of like some big activism organisations or like more extreme factions referring to or like likening some factory farm processes to like something like rape or things like that? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, there's problems with that. I mean, there are some comparisons, I suppose, in terms of because when you have, say, I showed you the sow. So how is she made pregnant? Well, some of them use artificial insemination. The others basically they do sort of hold, you know, tie her to a rack so that the boar can mate with her. So you know you could make that comparison. Just as people have also made comparisons between the way we treat animals and what the Nazis did to the Jews. That comparison was even made by Isaac Bashevis Singer, the great Jewish writer, who said for the animals it's an eternal Treblinka. Now, you know, many people find that offensive, and I can see why. So I'm, you know, somewhat reluctant to make that comparison. There are obviously differences as well in both the rape case and in that case. So I tend not to make them, but I can sort of understand why people get so frustrated at the thought that people are just not seeing what we're doing to animals, that they make fairly extreme and sometimes offensive comparisons.
We have one more question, time for one more question.
Okay, I think you and that. Yeah.
What do you think going forward now should be the role of societies and government? Should this be consumer-led, or should, as a collective community, come together and say, when we really want to drive change in this area?
So does it have to be an either-or? Because I think we do need to put pressure on government to make change. So I've a couple of times mentioned the live export trade. It's very hard for us as consumers to do anything about that, but I think we need to join with and support Animals Australia, who basically has been the organisation that's done the running on that you know, took the video to Four Corners or 60 Minutes, I can't remember where it was now. But anyway, you know, got it and then ran the campaign against government to change, and is still running that from legal actions. So I think we should support that. That's a way of getting institutional change. We should support political parties like the Greens that are more sympathetic both to the environmental issues I've raised and to animal welfare issues. But I don't see why, you know, in any way changing our own consumption patterns and being more ethical consumers is incompatible with that. We can do that at the same time, and in fact I think it demonstrates our sincerity and conviction. And also the more people who do that, the weaker will become the animal producing lobby, because they're very powerful politically, because they're big producers, they get lots of revenues, and if we can reduce that even a little bit, you know, even make 10%, 20% inroads into reducing that, then there'll be that much less money that they can put into lobbying governments.
All right.
Thanks very much. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of your questions.
Thank you again, Peter, for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know, you know, you do a lot for the animals, and effective altruism is like making the world a better place. So thank you. I hope a lot of you learned a lot of new things today, and that you've got some of your burning questions answered. Yes. So this concludes the event. But we've also got booklets from Animals Australia that Peter's actually co-founded. It's an animal protection organization, and they've got vegetarian starter kits where everything in it is vegan as well. So if you're interested, pick one on the way out. There are other resources available as well. And also, we're the Vegan Club, and if you're interested in joining us, we do a lot of different things. We do potlucks, picnics, barbecues. We do like talks. We do film screenings and things like that. We're a really fun community. So if you want to get involved in the vegan space, then come talk to us afterwards. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming, and I hope you have a brilliant day.